What's up, guys? Welcome to Fed by Fire. I got a treat for you guys tonight? So when I first started looking into Peter Lloyd Coley, one of the first things that caught my attention was the fact that this was a PCP story, because PCP is one of those drugs that I heard about constantly when I was growing up. I was part of the drug scene, but ironically, it's one of those few drugs that I never actually got to try. I had people tell me stories about PCP. I heard street stories. I heard people talk about what it supposedly did to people, how strong it was, how different of a substance it was from everything else. I heard all kinds of stories about people who had gotten completely out of their mind on it. So when I came across the name Peter Lloyd Coley and started digging into the actual records, I realized this wasn't just another random story about somebody who supposedly sold PCP. There was an actual federal case behind it, a documented story that was much bigger than the rumors that I had heard growing up. And before we go any further, I want to make something very clear. A lot of people who have been around the drug world for a long time have heard stories about old school dealers and manufacturers, and sometimes those stories get passed around for years until nobody really knows where the original information came from. So with this one, I'm going to separate what I personally heard from people from what I can actually document through federal court records and contemporary reporting. If something is something I heard, I'll tell you that. If something is something from a court document, I'll tell you that too. Because the real story is already crazy enough without adding any spice or pizzazz to it. The person we're talking about is Peter Lloyd Coley, and the federal records show that he was involved in a major PCP manufacturing and distribution conspiracy that stretched across multiple states. The case was prosecuted in the Western District of Virginia, right here in Roanoke, and that's one of the parts of this story that really drew me to it and caught my attention, because when you hear about major drug operations from decades ago, you might automatically think of Los Angeles or New York, Miami, Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., but this particular operation had a significant Virginia connection. According to federal court records, Coley was involved in an organization that obtained chemicals used to manufacture PCP and moved those chemicals from California into Virginia. Those chemicals were stored at locations in Virginia, including areas around Appomattox and Farmville, and PCP was manufactured in Virginia before being distributed towards the Washington, D.C. area. So we're not talking about somebody who's simply had a little bit of PCP in his pocket. We're talking about a supply chain. California was involved, Virginia was involved, and Washington, D.C. was involved. And the federal government ultimately treated Peter Lloyd Coley as one of the key people in that operation. Contemporary reporting from the Washington Post described Coley as the leader of a nationwide hallucinogenic drug manufacturing ring. Prosecutors said the organization was responsible for supplying tens of millions of doses of PCP to dealers in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, whenever you hear a number like tens of millions of doses, you gotta take it with a grain of salt. That's the kind of thing where I think it's important to stop and explain that this wasn't estimating how much drugs this guy supposedly moved. That's what was reported about the government's case at the time. The federal court records itself described the operation as a major multi-PCP manufacturing, multi-state ring and distribution conspiracy. This is where the story gets really interesting, because a PCP manufacturing requires more than just somebody finding a source for finished drugs. The operation involves precursors, chemicals, and one of those chemicals mentioned in the federal records was piperidine, which can be used in PCP production. According to the testimony discussed in the federal proceedings, Coley and another defendant, Denise Martina Charlize, were involved in transporting chemicals from LA towards Virginia. The chemicals were reportedly moved using U-Haul trucks and other rental trucks and trailers, and also, there were other vehicles that were loaded with old furniture as a way of disguising what was actually being transported. Think about that for a second. This was happening decades ago. There weren't encrypted phones in everybody's pocket. There weren't modern messaging apps. There wasn't social media where you could communicate with somebody instantly from across the country. If you wanted to move a large amount of chemicals from California to Virginia, you physically had to move it. You needed transportation. You needed people. You needed somewhere to put it. You needed somewhere to manufacture it, and then you needed somewhere to market it. And according to federal prosecutors, Coley's organization had pieces that were all connected. The chemicals came from California. They made their way into Virginia. The manufacturing took place in Virginia, and the finished PCP moved its way towards Washington, D.C. And that's what makes this story so interesting to me personally, because I've spent a lot of time hearing people talk about this from different generations, and PCP always seemed to be this strange piece of the puzzle that existed before I was really old enough to understand what was happening. Obviously, I heard the stories about it from people who had been around way longer than I was, people who, would tell you about somebody getting high on PCP, acting like a completely different person, ripping their clothes off and running to the ice box at a convenience store, that type of thing. People would tell stories about people supposedly becoming superhuman or violent or doing crazy things. Like I said, PCP is one of those drugs that I personally never got to try. I had experimented with plenty of psychedelics and hallucinogens over the years, but PCP wasn't one of them. So when I hear these old stories, there's always a part of me that was curious about what was actually happening versus what became street mythology over time. And that's another reason I'm interested in cases like this, because instead of listening to somebody say, man, back in the day there was this guy who was moving all this PCP, we can actually look back at the federal paperwork, and in Peter Lloyd Coley's case, the paperwork exists. The federal case was criminal number 796CR30013, and it happened right here in the Western District of Virginia on March 22nd, 1996. Coley was named in an 8-count superseding indictment. Then on July 9th, 1996, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts. One was conspiracy to manufacture and distribute PCP. The other was illegal disposal of hazardous waste, and that hazardous waste charge is important because we're talking about an illegal manufacturing operation involving chemicals. This wasn't just about the finished drug like we usually see. The environmental hazardous waste side of the operation became part of the federal prosecution too. The sentencing consequences were enormous. Based on the drug quantity attributed to the conspiracy, Coley's base offense level under the federal sentencing guidelines was 38. The court then applied the enhancements for his role in the offense and the reduction for accepting responsibility, resulting in an offense level of 39. But his criminal history made things a little worse. According to the later federal court opinion, Coley already had 2 previous PCP-related convictions in 1988 in Los Angeles. He was convicted of conspiracy to manufacture and sell PCP and received a 4-year prison sentence, and in 1991 in the Eastern District of Arkansas, he was convicted of conspiracy to possess PCP with intent to distribute. So this wasn't his first rodeo. He was released from that sentence in 94, and then according to federal record, from 94 through 96, he became involved in another major PCP conspiracy. By the time the federal government was sentencing him in 96, this wasn't being treated as his first encounter, obviously, with the PCP business. The court considered his prior convictions when determining his criminal history and career offender status. His guidelines ranged was calculated at 360 months to life. That's 30 years to life. And on November 12, 1996, Peter Lloyd Coley was sentenced to 500 months in federal prison. 500 months. That's over 41 years. The Washington Post reported the sentencing at the time under the headline 41 Years in Drug Case. The judge also imposed 10 years of supervised release after the prison sentence. Another defendant in the case, Denise Martina, that his right hand pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received 5 years and 6 months. 3 other men had also pleaded guilty to the conspiracy charges and were awaiting sentencing. So by this point, this wasn't some small local drug case. Federal prosecutors had dismantled what they described as a nationwide PCP manufacturing operation, and Coley was receiving more than 4 decades in federal prison. But the story didn't stop there. Coley appealed his sentencing. The Fourth Circuit revealed the case in '98. The appellate court confirmed the underlying convictions and the prison sentence. There was an issue with the $10,000 fine because the sentencing court had not accurately considered the financial burden fine could have been placed on Coley's dependents, including his wife and 8 children, but the prison sentence remained. Then in 2002, the government filed a motion that resulted in Coley's 500-month sentence being reduced to 240 months. 240 months is 20 years. So the sentence that originally looked like more than 4 decades eventually became 20 years. Coley eventually completed that sentence and was released to supervised release in October 2012. And you would think that after spending decades in the federal system, that might be the end of the story. But it wasn't, because in 2016, Peter Lloyd Coley was back in trouble. On March 2016, police stopped Coley in Los Angeles, California. According to the later federal record, officers found a 5-gallon Ziploc bag containing suspected narcotics, approximately 100 smaller plastic baggies, and 16 10-gallon metal containers. Samples of suspected narcotics were tested, and the federal court record says they contained chemicals used in the manufacture of PCP. And that's an important detail, because the court wasn't simply saying that somebody found a random bag of drugs in his car. The evidence discussed by the court involved chemicals that were associated with PCP manufacturing, so he couldn't get enough. Then in 2019, Coley was charged in California with manufacturing controlled substance. He pleaded no contest and received a 17-year sentence with all but 30 days suspended, followed by 5 years of probation. And because he was still under supervised release from the old Virginia case, that California conviction created another federal problem. The federal government moved to revoke his supervised release, and on November 5, 2019, Coley admitted that he had violated the conditions of his supervised release, requiring him not to commit another federal or state or any type of local crime. The federal court calculated his guidelines range at 51 to 63 months. The judge imposed 51 months. Coley began serving the sentence in January 2020, and now we're getting into the part of the story that I think makes it much more complicated than simply saying this guy was a PCP dealer and got locked up, because while he was serving that later sentence, federal sentencing law was changing. One of the issues involved how certain federal drug conspiracy convictions were treated under the career offender provisions of the sentencing guidelines. Later court decisions changed the way those offenses were evaluated, and Coley argued that if his situation were being calculated under the newer interpretation of the law, he would not have received the same career offender treatment. The federal court agreed that this created a significant difference. Instead of guidelines ranging from 51 to 63 months, the court calculated that without the career offender designation, his applicable range would have been 37 to 46 months, and that's a 14-month difference at the bottom end. And by this point, Coley was 65 years old. The court also considered that what he had done while he was incarcerated. The 2023 opinion noted that he had no disciplinary infractions during his incarceration and participated in programs including narcotics treatment and approximately 1,000 hours of occupational training. The court also noted that his criminal history did not include weapons or violent convictions. Coley had also been on home confinement since December of 2021, without an indication that he had violated the terms. There was another personal circumstance that came up with his request for release. His wife was seriously ill, and that during home confinement he had been helping transport her to her medical appointments, but her health had deteriorated. She eventually moved into her daughter's home. Coley asked the court to release him so that he could provide more care for her before the court could rely on that circumstance. However, his wife died, so that particular argument became not such a good one. But the court still considered the other factors, and this is where the legal story takes a turn that I don't think people would expect if they only heard the street version of Peter Lloyd Coley's story. The judge didn't erase the seriousness of his past. The judge didn't say the PCP conspiracy wasn't serious. In fact, the court specifically described his criminal history as extremely serious. The opinion discussed in his 1988 PCP conviction, his 1991 PCP conviction, and his multi-state PCP manufacturing and distribution conspiracy from 1994 through 96, as well as the 2016 California incident involving those chemicals and equipment associated with manufacturing. The court essentially recognized that this was somebody who had spent a significant portion of his life involved in PCP trafficking and manufacturing, but the court has also considered the law as it existed in 2023. And the court determined the sentencing, created by change in federal law combined with Coley's age and conduct while incarcerated, his lack of disciplinary problems, and his circumstances on home confinement amounted to extraordinary or compelling reasons for a sentence reduction. So on April 10, 2026, the United States District Court of the Western District of Virginia granted Coley's motions and compassionate release and reduced his sentence to time served. And that's where the documented federal story currently leaves us. When you put an entire timeline together, it's a wild one. 1998, a PCP conspiracy conviction in Los Angeles. 91, another related federal conviction in Arkansas. In 94, release from that, sentenced. 94 through 96, another multi-state PCP manufacturing and distribution conspiracy. California chemicals moving towards Virginia storage locations. I thought this was a crazy story personally. PCP manufacturing in Virginia, the distribution towards D.C. 1996, federal indictment in the Western District of Virginia. The guilty plea in 96, a 500-month sentence. The 1998 appellate review. The 2002 sentence reduced to 240 months. The 2012 release to supervised release. The 2016 California incident involving chemicals and equipment that federal court later described as connected to PCP manufacturing, and the conviction in 2019. Federal supervised release violation in 2020, another federal sentence in 2021, home confinement, and then 2023 compassionate release after reduction to time served. And that's why I think this is a perfect story for Fed by Fire, because when I was younger, I was hearing people talk about PCP, and I didn't know anything about Peter Lloyd Coley. I didn't know the federal case number. I didn't know about Virginia being part of a manufacturing chain. I didn't know there were precursor chemicals being moved across the country. I didn't know anything about this case or how it ended up involving hazardous waste charges. I didn't know the original sentencing was 500 months, and I definitely didn't know that decades later the same man would end up back in federal court because of changes in sentencing laws and the way his old conviction was being treated. That's the difference between the stories we hear on the street and what you find when you actually start pulling out the court documents and peeling the layers back. Sometimes the street story is exaggerated, sometimes it's completely wrong, and sometimes you start digging and realize the documented story is even crazier than what people were telling you to begin with. Peter Lloyd Coley, the record gives us enough without having to add anything. He was convicted of conspiracy to manufacture and distribution of PCP, federal prosecutors described as a nationwide operation. The court documented precursor chemicals that were moving all across the country. The court documented distribution charges the government described as massive quantities reaching the D.C. area market, and Coley received one of the longest sentences in the case. But his story also shows something else. Drug cases aren't frozen in time. People change, laws change, sentencing guidelines change, and sometimes a case that started in the 1990s can still be moving through the federal courts almost 30 years later. So if you've ever heard stories about old school PCP and wondering how much of it was actually true, this is one of those cases where we can separate the mythology from the paperwork and the personality from what's actually there. And that's what's interesting to me the most, because PCP was one of the few drugs I never tried but was always curious about, and I heard plenty of stories about it. I heard people talk about it like it was some completely different category of drug, but I never got to experience it myself. Now, years later, instead of finding out what PCP was like, putting it in my own body, I'm able to look back at history surrounding it and see what it did to the people who got caught up in that world. Peter Lloyd Coley is a perfect example, a man whose name became connected to a massive conspiracy, a conspiracy that stretched multiple states, a federal sentence more than 41 years, a sentence later reduced to 20 years, a release from prison, another case put on you, another federal sentence, and finally, decades after the original conspiracy, a judge decided that changes in the law and Coley's circumstances justified reducing the final sentence and gave him time served. And that's the documented story. And if you've ever heard a different version of his story over the years, I'd be interested to know what you heard. So drop it in the comments if you've heard anything about this story. This is exactly what kind of history, that we love to hear when it's passed down around the street and in real life, from the real records sitting inside the federal courtroom that they don't always sound as the same story you heard out of someone's mouth. But in this case, the federal paperwork gives us one hell of a fucking story all by itself. Thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. Peace.